A millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years, but his new assistant changed everything. Before watching the video, please leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. The headquarters of Caldwell and Pierce Inc. was as sleek and sterile as the man who ran it. The air inside was always cold, not just from the industrial-grade air conditioning, but from the man whose presence alone seemed to freeze time itself, Alexander Pierce, CEO, billionaire, untouchable. And not just in the metaphorical sense. Alexander had a very specific, very well-known rule. He never allowed physical contact, especially with women. No handshakes, no accidental brushes, no friendly pats on the shoulder. Nothing. At first, people assumed it was arrogance, the eccentricity of yet another powerful man who believed he was above everyone else. But as the years passed, 20 to be exact, the staff learned it was something deeper, more personal. A kind of invisible armor, forged by past pain and held together by fear. The women at Caldwell and Pierce adjusted. They kept a respectful distance. They learned to slide papers across the desk instead of handing them to him. No one questioned the rule anymore. It had become as much a part of the company culture as coffee in the break room or quarterly bonuses. And then Ella Monroe walked in. It was her first day as Alexander Pierce's new personal assistant. She'd been handpicked by HR, though no one knew why, especially since the last 3 assistants had all either quit or asked to be reassigned within a week. Ella was bright, efficient, and had no idea what she was walking into. The whispers started the moment she stepped out of the elevator. Is that her? She doesn't know, does she? Oh, she's gonna learn real fast. Ella, unaware, gave a polite smile to the people around her and made her way to the executive floor. There was something heavy in the air, a kind of tension that settled in her chest like static, but she shook it off. First days were always weird, she told herself. At precisely 8:05 a.m., Miriam, the stern executive secretary, poked her head into Ella's temporary workspace with a look of urgency. Mr. Pierce needs a tie, she said briskly. Grab one from the wardrobe in his dressing room and take it to him. Now. Ella blinked. A tie? He has a meeting in 10 minutes. Just pick one and bring it to his office. Ella nodded. Okay, sure, no problem. It was just a tie. What could possibly go wrong? The executive dressing room looked more like a boutique showroom, neatly arranged by color and fabric. Dozens, no, scores, of ties hung like soldiers in formation. Silk, cotton, patterns, solid, bold, subdued. So many choices. She stared for a long moment, then murmured under her breath, "What does a cold, emotionally frozen CEO wear to an important meeting?" She picked out a navy blue one, then reconsidered and reached for a black one, then a charcoal gray. Then, in a panic, she just grabbed all of them. With an armful of neckwear and a pounding heart, Ella marched toward the CEO's office. She was going to hand him a tie, say, "Here you go," turn around, walk out, easy. She knocked once. A low, stern voice responded, "Come in." Ella pushed open the door and stepped into a space that felt more like a boardroom than an office. Everything was pristine, glass, steel, dark wood. And standing behind his desk was Alexander Pierce, tall, impeccably dressed, and exuding the kind of authority that made you forget how to breathe. He was adjusting his cufflinks when he looked up. "What is that?" he asked sharply. "Ties," Ella said, stepping forward. "All of them. I didn't know which color you'd prefer." He stared at her, expression unreadable. Then with a sigh that sounded like it came from the depths of a very tired soul, he said, "Give me one." Ella dropped the ties onto his desk and randomly grabbed the first one she saw. Unfortunately, it was a light blue silk tie covered in tiny rubber duck prints. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Ella glanced at the tie and gasped. "Oh, no, wait, not that one." She snatched it back and quickly handed him a different one. "Here, navy blue." He gave a brief nod of approval. She smiled, relieved. Mission accomplished. Time to exit, stage left. But then, she saw it. Alexander was tying the tie all wrong. The knot was sloppy, uneven, too tight on one side, too loose on the other. It looked like he was strangling himself with an expensive piece of fabric. Ella couldn't help it. Her need for order outweighed her common sense. "Wait," she said, stepping closer. "You're doing it wrong. Let me—" And she reached out. Her fingers brushed the skin of his neck. the world stopped. Alexander's entire body tensed like he'd just touched a live wire. His eyes went wide. He jerked back as if burned, breathing sharp and shallow. Ella's hand hovered in the air, frozen. "Oh my God, what just happened?" "You touched me," he said, voice tight. I I was just fixing your tie." His jaw clenched. "Never do that again." Ella raised her eyebrows. "Okay, sure, relax. I'm not radioactive." "You don't understand," Alexander said, rubbing the spot she'd touched like he could erase her presence from his skin. "Then make me understand," she replied, folding her arms. "Because honestly, this makes zero sense." "I can't be touched," he whispered. "Not by women." The air turned still. Ella didn't laugh. She didn't tease. Because in his voice, beneath the edge of anger, she heard something else. Fear. She slowly lifted her hands in surrender. "All right, I won't touch you again." Alexander's shoulders eased just slightly. "You can go." Ella turned to leave, but couldn't help muttering, "One day I'm going to figure out what's so terrifying about a simple touch." As she walked out, confused and rattled, Alexander stood motionless, staring at the floor. His heart thundered in his chest. He reached up and touched the exact spot where her fingers had brushed his skin. It still burned. And that terrified him more than anything else. When Ella Monroe stepped out of Alexander Pierce's office, her mind was a whirlwind of questions, confusion, and secondhand embarrassment. She'd only tried to help. It was just a tie, just a brush of fingers. And yet, the CEO of one of the largest corporations in the country had reacted like she'd just set him on fire. She returned to her desk and dropped into her chair, rubbing her temples. Her first day on the job, and she'd already broken some unspoken law of the land. Around her, quiet glances and subtle whispers buzzed like bees. She didn't have to ask to know they were talking about what had just happened. "Still breathing?" a voice asked casually beside her. Ella looked up. James Carter, head of finance, mid-30s, slightly disheveled, always with a coffee in hand and the kind of smirk that said he'd seen more chaos than anyone else in the room. She blinked. "What do you mean?" James leaned on her desk and sipped from his mug. "You touched Alexander Pierce." Ella frowned. "Technically, yes, but that's only because he was strangling himself with a silk tie and my inner perfectionist couldn't handle it." James stared at her like she'd just admitted to committing treason. "You physically touched him?" She nodded. "I fixed his tie." James let out a low whistle. "Well then, congratulations. You just broke a 20-year rule." Ella blinked. What?" "No one touches him, Ella, no one. There are people who've worked here for 15 years and have never so much as stood within a foot of him." "Well, maybe someone should have warned me before he went into cardiac arrest," she muttered, more to herself than to him. James chuckled. "Yeah, well, I don't think anyone expected you to last past lunch." Ella rolled her eyes. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." But as much as she tried to shake it off, she couldn't forget the look on Alexander's face, that frozen, haunted expression. It wasn't anger, not really. It was fear, pure and raw. She wasn't sure what scared her more, that she'd seen it or that it had made her curious. Back in his office, Alexander Pierce sat motionless at his desk. The report on his screen blurred into lines and meaningless numbers. He'd built his world on order, control, distance. He didn't do surprises. He didn't do mistakes, and he absolutely didn't do touch. For 20 years, he had trained himself to recoil, to build walls so high that no one, not even himself, could peer over them. He had structured his life like a fortress, no intimacy, no vulnerability, no chance of being hurt again. And yet, with one accidental touch, this woman, this assistant he barely knew, had cracked the surface. What troubled him the most wasn't that she touched him. It was that he didn't hate it. 2 hours later, Ella was reviewing a draft for the upcoming investor meeting when the intercom on her desk buzzed. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Pierce would like to see you." She stared at the speaker. "Again?" "Yes, please bring the investor report. He wants it delivered by hand." Ella raised an eyebrow. Was he serious? But she gathered the documents anyway and made her way to the door that, only hours ago, she'd walked out of in embarrassment. When she entered, Alexander was standing behind his desk, his face unreadable as always. "Here's the report," she said, keeping her voice neutral. He held out his hand. She hesitated for a split second, then stepped forward and gave him the folder. Their fingers brushed. Barely. Just a second. But his body reacted again. Shoulders stiffened, breath caught. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like nothing. But to him, it felt like a collision, a storm beneath the surface. A sheet of paper slipped from the folder and fluttered to the floor. Ella bent down to retrieve it, just as Alexander did the same. Their foreheads bumped, soft, accidental. They froze. Their eyes met, far too close. Ella blinked, trying not to laugh. Well, if that was a reflex test, congratulations. You passed. Alexander cleared his throat, straightened, and quickly gathered the remaining pages. It wasn't a test. Oh, sure, bumping heads is standard protocol here. He ignored the sarcasm and turned back to his desk. Ella crossed her arms. Mr. Pierce? Yes? Are you nervous? He looked at her with the same detached coldness. I don't get nervous. She smirked. Then you won't mind if I do this. She raised her hand, slow, teasing, not to touch him, but just to see. He took a step back so fast he nearly tripped. She burst out laughing. Wow, for someone who doesn't get nervous, that was dramatic. He glared. That's enough for today. You can leave. Ella walked out, still chuckling under her breath. And Alexander, for the second time that day, had no idea what had just happened to him. The hours that followed were a blur. Meetings came and went. Calls were made. Contracts signed. But Alexander wasn't really there. His mind kept circling back to her. Ella Monroe, the woman who walked in and undid 20 years of carefully constructed isolation with a smile, a comment, and the lightest touch imaginable. He hated distractions. They cost time, money, focus, and yet she was becoming the most unavoidable distraction of all. He saw her in the hallway, laughing with other employees. He caught himself noticing things, how she bit her lip when reading something complicated, how she tapped her pen against her notebook while thinking, the way she wore her bracelets loosely so they clicked softly when she moved. It was maddening, and in the middle of it all, she made a mistake, a minor one. Just a formatting error on a report, something that should have been fixed in seconds. But it was enough. He pressed the intercom. Miss Monroe, my office, now. A pause, then her voice half joking. Right now? Like, right now? Yes. 2 minutes later, she walked in. You know, if you call me like that again, I'm going to have a heart attack. He held up the paper. What is this? Ella glanced at it. A piece of paper? He narrowed his eyes. What's wrong with it? She looked again. Okay, fine. The columns aren't aligned, but come on, no one died because of a misaligned chart. If I wanted chaos, I'd start a tech startup and wear flip-flops. He almost smiled. Almost. You don't wear flip-flops at home, do you? She asked. He closed his eyes, officially out of patience. All right, she said, raising her hands. I'll fix it. No more crooked tables, I promise. As she turned to leave, he blurted, Do you always talk to yourself? She stopped. What? I saw you earlier, mumbling at your desk. Ella's eyes widened. You saw that? He nodded. She groaned. Oh no, that's terrible. I try so hard to seem normal and now you know my weird quirk. He frowned. Talking to yourself is not a flaw. She narrowed her eyes. You're not messing with me, are you? I don't have time to mess with people, he said. I'm a CEO. She stared at him, then laughed. It was full, bright, and unfiltered. And for the first time in years, Alexander felt comfortable. Not guarded, not calculating. Just present. And that, more than anything, was dangerous. Alexander Pierce didn't like chaos. He didn't like uncertainty. And most of all, he didn't like how much he was starting to notice Ella Monroe. In the days following their encounters, the tikai, the forehead bump, the whispered sarcasm, something inside him began to shift. Quietly, uncomfortably, like the slow creaking of a door that hadn't been opened in years. He tried to return to normal, to bury himself in routines. He arrived at the office at 7 o'clock sharp, drank the same black coffee, reviewed the same reports, walked the same corridors. But now he found himself looking for her, in the break room, the elevator, even during meetings. His eyes scanned the room almost instinctively, and when he spotted her, the day felt slightly less unbearable. And when he didn't, it felt too quiet. At first, he told himself it was curiosity, just mild interest. But it wasn't. It was her laughter echoing down the hallway like wind chimes in a storm. It was the way she sometimes talked to herself when she was alone at her desk, her voice low and playful. It was the way she wasn't afraid of him. She didn't lower her gaze when he looked her way. She didn't stammer when she spoke. She challenged him with humor, with questions, with her presence, and that, Alexander realized, was what scared him the most. One Thursday afternoon, Alexander was in the conference room, sitting at the head of the table, reviewing a high-stakes merger contract. A dozen executives sat around him, laptops open, eyes on him. But his eyes drifted. Through the glass wall, he could see Ella. She was at her desk, completely absorbed in her screen, frowning as she typed something. Her lips moved, barely noticeable, talking herself through a sentence. Then she smiled. Not for anyone else. Just to herself. Alexander's heart skipped. "Mr. Pierce?" someone called. He blinked. "Yes?" "We were just waiting on your final approval." He looked down at the page in front of him and saw nothing but ink and noise. For the first time in years, he was distracted, not by numbers, not by risk, but by a woman who had no idea she was rewriting the rules he'd lived by. Later that day, Ella made a small mistake. It wasn't major, just a data formatting issue in a financial report. But it was enough to irritate Alexander. Not because it affected the company, but because it gave him an excuse. He pressed the intercom button with more force than necessary. "Miss Monroe, my office, immediately." There was a pause, then her voice light and teasing. "You know, you're really good at making simple instructions sound like threats." He didn't answer. 2 minutes later, she appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, an amused expression on her face. "You called?" Alexander stood and held up the document. "What is this?" Ella took the paper, scanned it, and tilted her head. "A very slightly misaligned bar chart?" He raised an eyebrow. "And you thought that was acceptable?" She smirked. "Listen, if I wanted cash, I'd be a DJ, not a data analyst. It was late. My eyes were tired. The universe will survive." Alexander said nothing. Ella stepped forward and placed the corrected version on his desk. "There, all fixed. See? No need to summon thunder and lightning." Before she turned to leave, she paused. Then with a small smile, she said, "You know, for someone who avoids touch, you sure like calling me into close quarters." He stiffened. She caught it, the way his jaw tensed, the way his hands clenched slightly by his sides. "I didn't mean anything by it," she added quickly, more softly this time. "I know," he said, but his voice was quiet, distant, as if he were answering a question he wasn't ready to understand. That evening, Alexander stayed late at the office. Everyone else had gone home. The city lights glowed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long reflections across the marble floor. He sat alone in his office, staring at the same paragraph in a contract for over 30 minutes. He should have gone home hours ago. He should have moved on, focused. But his mind kept circling back to the same thing, Ella's touch, the accidental brush of her fingers against his skin, the warmth, the softness, and worst of all, the feeling that he didn't want it to stop. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, frustrated. He had spent years building walls. Why now? Why her? The next morning, everything felt off. Alexander arrived at the office at his usual time, walked the same path, greeted no one, avoided eye contact, until he passed Ella's desk. She looked up from her coffee and smiled. "Morning, boss. Ready for a day filled with spreadsheets and crushing capitalism?" He stopped. That smile, the casual way she greeted him, like she wasn't afraid, like she didn't care that he was Alexander Pierce, billionaire CEO of a global empire. It unbalanced him. "The report?" he asked, his voice more abrupt than he intended. "Right here," she said, handing it to him. Their fingers brushed again and again. He felt it. Not panic, not repulsion. Something else. Something dangerous. This time, she didn't let go right away. She held the folder for a second longer than necessary and looked directly into his eyes. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice calm but sincere. He pulled the folder with a little more force than needed. "I'm perfectly fine." "Right," she said, unconvinced. He turned away before she could say anything else, retreating into his office like a man being chased by ghosts. The day dragged. He tried to focus, but failed. He couldn't ignore it anymore. She was everywhere. Not physically, but in his thoughts, his chest, his skin. And when he saw her laughing with James Carter near the coffee machine, something twisted inside him, a tight, uncomfortable feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. Jealousy. The realization hit him like a slap. He had no claim to her. She was his assistant. Nothing more. But his body didn't care about labels. He walked over. Quick. Controlled. "Miss Monroe," he said curtly. She turned, mid-laugh, eyes still bright. "Yes, Mr. Pierce? I need to speak with you." James arched a brow, clearly amused. "Well, I will leave you two to it." Alexander ignored him. He turned and led Ella away, not saying a word until they were in the corridor near the elevators. She looked at him, puzzled. "What's wrong?" "I don't like it, Mom," he said suddenly. She blinked. "Don't like what?" "You laughing, with him." Her brow lifted. "Are you jealous?" He said nothing. She tilted her head, curious now. "Because if you are, you could just say it, you know." "I'm not jealous." She smiled softly. "Sure, boss." Then she touched his wrist, barely, gently, her fingertips resting like a question against his skin. "Tell me the truth, Alexander. What are you really afraid of?" He couldn't answer because the truth was too big, too real, and it scared him more than anything else ever had. That night, Alexander Pierce couldn't sleep. The city skyline blinked through the tall glass windows of his penthouse, but he didn't see it. He lay in bed, arms behind his head, eyes fixed on the ceiling, a man drowning in thoughts he had spent 2 decades running from. He could still feel Ella's touch on his wrist. It had lasted less than 2 seconds, and yet it lingered, as if it wasn't skin that remembered, but soul. She had asked him a question earlier that day, her voice soft yet piercing. "What are you really afraid of?" He hadn't answered, because how could he? How do you explain to someone that your fear isn't of them, but of yourself? Of feeling again, of trusting, of the moment when someone looks you in the eyes, sees through the armor, and walks away anyway. He had lived through that once, and it broke him. 16 years ago, Alexander had been a very different man. Still sharp, still ambitious, but open, hopeful, human, and he'd loved someone. Her name was Isabel Reed. She had eyes like summer and a smile that made the world tilt sideways. He gave her everything, his time, his attention, even the dreams he never spoke aloud. He was going to propose. He had the ring, until the day he walked into a dinner party and saw her in another man's arms. A wealthier man, an older executive with international holdings and a private jet. Alexander confronted her that night, asked her if it was true. She hadn't cried. She hadn't begged. She had only said, with a perfectly calm voice, "You were never enough, Alex. You have potential, but I need security." And just like that, she was gone. So he built walls, strong, silent, impenetrable. No more touch, no more women, no more vulnerability, only work, only power. Because you can't lose what you don't let in. Until Ella Monroe. The woman who walked into his office with a pile of ties and touched him without fear. She had no idea what she was doing, how she was undoing him, piece by piece. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office early, as always, but nothing felt routine anymore. He walked past his staff, ignoring the greetings, keeping his eyes forward, until he reached her desk. Ella was already there, typing with focus, a coffee beside her. Her hair was tied loosely. A pencil rested behind her ear. She didn't notice him right away, and somehow, that bothered him. He cleared his throat. "Morning." Ella looked up, surprised. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce." He nodded toward the meeting agenda in her hand. "You're ready?" "Always," she said, and handed him the folder. Their fingers brushed, again. But this time he didn't pull away, and neither did she. Their eyes met for just a second too long. Then he turned, murmuring, "Follow me." The meeting passed like a blur, numbers, presentations, contracts. But Alexander barely registered a word, because he could feel her presence just 2 seats down. Because every time Ella shifted in her chair, every time she made a note or looked up, his body reacted, with warmth, with awareness, with something dangerously close to longing. After the meeting, as the other executives filed out, he looked at her. Stay, she paused. Is something wrong? No, he said. I just need a moment. When the door closed behind them, silence fell. Alexander walked to the window, hands behind his back. Ella waited. I wasn't always like this, he said quietly. You know that, right? She tilted her head. Like what? This distant, cold, disconnected. He turned to her. His eyes were different now, not hard, not sharp, but heavy, vulnerable. I trusted someone once. Gave her everything. She left. Ella didn't speak. She just watched him. Let him open that wound at his own pace. I stopped believing in all of it. Intimacy, connection, people. He paused. And then you walked in. Ella blinked. I didn't mean to mess anything up. You didn't mess it up, he said softly. You woke it up. Their eyes locked. The air felt different now, thicker, realer. I don't know what to do with this, Alexander admitted. You confuse me. Ella stepped closer. You scare me, he added, and then quietly, but I don't want you to stop. Later that evening, Ella was getting ready to leave when her phone buzzed. Text from Alexander Pierce, dinner, 7 p.m. I'll pick you up. She stared at the message for a full minute. No explanation, no follow-up, just a quiet demand, cloaked in invitation. And somehow it was enough. At exactly 7 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up outside her building. Ella stepped out, dressed in a navy blue cocktail dress. Simple, elegant, strong. When Alexander saw her, his breath caught. He didn't compliment her, but the way his eyes lingered said everything. They drove in silence. But it wasn't awkward, it was charged. At the restaurant, he opened the door for her, led her through the candlelit space, and waited until they were seated before speaking. This isn't a business dinner, he said. I figured, Ella replied, smiling faintly. He exhaled. I'm not good at this. Neither am I, she said. But maybe we don't have to be. The waiter came, orders were placed. Wine poured. And for the first time, Alexander Pierce talked about himself. Not the CEO, not the empire, the man. He told her about his childhood, his father's silence, his mother's warmth, his early years in finance, when he still believed success would make him feel whole. He told her about Isabel, and when he did, Ella reached across the table, slowly, carefully, and touched his hand, and he didn't flinch. As they walked out into the night air, something had changed. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. At her doorstep, she turned to him. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For letting me see who you really are. Alexander didn't know what to say, so instead he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't cautious. It was real, raw. Everything he had been holding back came out in that kiss. And when it ended and Ella opened her eyes, she whispered, So, what happens now? Alexander swallowed. I don't know. But you're not going to run? He shook his head. Not this time. Monday morning came quietly, wrapped in gray clouds and soft rain tapping on the office windows. Inside Caldwell and Pierce, the usual rhythm unfolded. Coffee brewing, shoes clicking on marble floors, muted voices echoing in the halls. But for Alexander Pierce, nothing felt the same. He stood in his office, staring out at the skyline, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, remembering the kiss, the weight of it, the rightness of it, and the terrifying realization that, for the first time in 20 years, he didn't want to run. But he also didn't know how to stay. He turned when he heard her voice, Ella Monroe, just outside, laughing at something one of the interns had said. It was casual, light, completely normal, and it made him restless. He had always been in control of his life, controlled his words, his space, his time. But with Ella, there were no guardrails. No distance he could keep that didn't feel unnatural. And the worst part, he didn't want distance anymore. Ella had expected things to change after the kiss, and they had, just not the way she imagined. Alexander didn't say anything about it. He didn't text, didn't call, didn't follow up with more invitations or soft confessions. He simply acted like it never happened, at least on the surface. But Ella noticed things. The way he looked at her during meetings. The way he hesitated when she got too close. The way his voice softened just a little when he said her name. He hadn't shut her out completely, but he hadn't let her in either. It was the in-between that was slowly wearing her down. One afternoon, as Ella passed his office, he called out, "Miss Monroe, a word." She stopped, took a slow breath, and stepped inside. "Yes, Mr. Pierce?" He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked at her as if trying to decide what version of himself to be. Then he said quietly, "I think it's best if we keep things professional." Ella blinked. "Professional?" Alexander nodded, looking away. "No blurred lines, no unnecessary closeness." She let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Right, because kissing your assistant is the very definition of professional." He flinched slightly. "I made a mistake," he said stiffly. Her face went blank. "A mistake?" "Yes." There was a beat of silence, heavy and sharp. "Okay," Ella said, voice even, "if that's how you feel." She turned and walked out, her heels clicking against the floor like punctuation marks in a silent sentence neither of them could finish. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Ella didn't linger at his door anymore, didn't bring him coffee, didn't tease him when he avoided eye contact in the hallway. She was polite, efficient, detached, exactly what he had asked for, but not at all what he wanted. By Thursday, Alexander was unraveling. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, wondering what she was thinking, wishing, aching for her to say something, anything that would undo what he had pushed away. But she didn't. Instead, she laughed with James Carter over lunch. She joked with the marketing team in the break room. And every time she smiled at someone else, it felt like punishment. He had told her to keep things professional. Now she was doing exactly that, and it was killing him. That night, he went to a private lounge downtown, somewhere quiet, upscale, discreet. He ordered a whiskey and sat in the back corner, trying to drown the echo of her voice in his mind. But the universe wasn't done with him yet. Because 20 minutes later, Ella walked in, and she wasn't alone. James Carter was beside her, laughing, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back as he guided her to a booth. Alexander froze. It wasn't a date. It couldn't be. Could it? He watched as Ella took a sip of her drink, her eyes sparkling. She looked free, unbothered. And then she glanced around the room. Their eyes met. Her smile faded, just slightly, but she didn't look away. Instead, she lifted her glass and toasted him from across the lounge, and turned back to James. 5 minutes later, Alexander stood beside their table. James looked up, startled. "Alexander, didn't expect to see you here." "I need to speak with Miss Monroe," Alexander said, eyes on her. Ella tilted her head. "Now?" "Yes." She sighed, clearly unimpressed. "All right." She stood and followed him to a quieter corner. Once they were out of earshot, she crossed her arms. "Let me guess, you're suddenly okay with blurring the lines again?" Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "I was wrong. You don't say. I thought distance would fix it, that if I pushed you away, things would go back to normal. But they didn't." Ella softened just slightly. "So, what do you want from me?" He looked at her, truly looked at her. "I want you," he said, "not just in my office, not just after hours. I want to try whatever this is, even if I don't know how." She studied him for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "You're going to have to prove that." "I will," he whispered. The next day, something changed. Alexander brought her coffee. He asked about her weekend. He walked beside her in the hallway instead of 3 steps ahead. It was subtle, but it was real. And Ella? She didn't push, didn't press. She just let him try. And every day he did, a little more. One Friday afternoon, as they sat in his office reviewing contracts, Ella dropped her pen. She bent to pick it up, and as she straightened, she said with a sly smile, "You're staring." Alexander blinked. "No, I'm not." "You were." "I was reviewing the numbers." "Sure you were." He shook his head, but his lips twitched with the hint of a smile. "You know," she said, "for someone who claims to hate distractions, you're very easily distracted." "Only by you." She looked up at him. And in that moment, he wasn't the CEO. He wasn't the man behind the walls. He was just a man, falling slowly, unevenly, but willingly. By the following week, everything had changed. Though neither Alexander nor Ella said it out loud, They still called each other Mr. Pierce and Miss Monroe during meetings. Still exchanged reports like nothing had happened. Still kept the tone formal in front of the team. But behind those closed office doors, there was something else. The glances lasted longer. The silence between sentences wasn't empty, it was electric. And sometimes when Ella leaned just a little too close, or when her fingers brushed his as she passed him a file, Alexander didn't pull away anymore. Instead, he let the moment stretch, just long enough to feel it, to let her in one breath at a time. But what they didn't talk about was the world outside that glass office, the rumors, the glances, the subtle changes people were beginning to notice. Alexander had always been the untouchable one, the man who never smiled, never lingered, never flirted. Now he lingered in conversation. Now he smiled, albeit faintly. And more than once, someone caught him watching Ella from across the room. It wasn't overt, wasn't scandalous, but it was enough. The whispers had begun. Ella could feel it too. At first, it didn't bother her. She was used to office gossip. But this was different, because this wasn't some meaningless crush or casual flirtation. This was the CEO, the man no one had ever dared to approach, let alone touch. And now they were watching. Every word she said, every time she entered his office, every accidental laugh she let slip when he said something dry and surprisingly funny. It felt like being under a microscope. And no matter how much she tried to act like it didn't matter, a small voice inside her kept whispering, "This isn't sustainable." On Wednesday, it all came to a head. The company was hosting a rooftop event at a luxury hotel, part networking, part PR. As always, Alexander was expected to attend. But this time, he asked Ella to come with him, not as his assistant, as his guest. She hesitated for a full 10 seconds before answering. "I'll need to find a dress," she said quietly. "I'll send one," he replied. At 6:59 p.m. sharp, Ella stepped out of her apartment to find Alexander waiting at the curb. When he saw her, his breath hitched. She wore a deep burgundy dress, elegant, open-backed, flowing just enough to catch the breeze. Her hair was curled softly, pinned behind one ear. Her lips painted in the faintest shade of rose. Alexander didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. The rooftops shimmered with chandeliers and string lights. Waiters glided through the crowd with champagne flutes. Jazz played softly in the background. The city skyline unfolded in every direction, a glittering reminder that they were standing at the top of the world. Ella stayed close to Alexander just as he'd asked, but she couldn't help noticing how many people watched them. Not just glancing, watching. And then came her. A tall blonde in a red dress, lips painted like warning signs, smile cool as glass. "Alexander," she said smoothly. He turned and something in his posture shifted. "Isabel," he said. Ella's heart stopped. The Isabel, Mamao, the woman who had once shattered him. Isabel's eyes flicked toward Ella, taking her in with surgical precision. "And this is?" Ella smiled before he could answer. "Ella Monroe. I'm with him." Alexander froze, but didn't correct her. Isabel tilted her head. "That's unexpected." Ella looped her arm through his, letting her hand rest against his chest. "He's full of surprises." The silence was tight enough to cut glass. Then Isabel smiled. Thin, cold, sharp. "Well, good luck with that." She turned and disappeared into the crowd. Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ella looked up at him. "You okay?" He nodded, jaw tight. "I just didn't expect to see her." "Well, you handled it like a pro," Ella whispered. 10 out of 10 for emotional poker face. He looked at her then, really looked. And for the first time in public, he reached for her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, warm and steady. And just like that, she knew. He wasn't running anymore. That night, as they stood by the glass railing watching the city lights below, he leaned in and whispered, "I'm not afraid of being seen with you." She smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Even if they talk?" "They've talked before. Even if it costs something?" He turned to her, gently lifting her chin so she'd look at him. "If I lose everything because I chose to feel again, then maybe everything I built wasn't worth as much as I thought." And in that moment, Ella saw it. Not the CEO, not the businessman, just the man who had finally let his guard down. They didn't kiss that night, not on the rooftop, not in the car ride home, not even when he walked her to her door. But when she turned the key and stepped inside, she leaned against the door and smiled to herself. Because she didn't need a kiss to know what was happening. She already felt it in her bones. Meanwhile, Alexander sat alone in the back of the car, staring out the window. His mind wasn't on the city or the company or tomorrow's meetings. It was on her, on what they were building. And for the first time in 2 decades, he wasn't afraid of it falling apart. Because for the first time, he wasn't building it alone. For a while, everything felt like it was falling into place. Alexander and Ella settled into a rhythm, one that didn't need to be explained with titles or definitions. They weren't just CEO and assistant anymore. They were something more, something fragile, something real. At work, they kept things professional, controlled, discreet. But behind closed doors, over quiet dinners, soft moments in the car, silent glances that said more than words ever could, they were slowly learning what it meant to share a life, not just a schedule. And for Alexander Pierce, that was terrifying and beautiful all at once. But it was only a matter of time before the outside world noticed. It started small. An investor asking about Ella by name during a board meeting. A magazine photographer capturing them standing too close at a charity gala. A subtle mention on a gossip blog. Alexander Pierce spotted with mystery woman at rooftop event. Not his usual solo act. Then came the questions from the board, at first veiled in humor, then with growing concern. Is it wise to get involved with someone who reports directly to you? How will this affect the company's reputation? What happens if it doesn't work out? Alexander didn't respond, not because he didn't know what to say, but because part of him was asking the same questions. One evening, after everyone had left the office, Ella walked into Alexander's office with a thick file in her hand. Final draft of the quarterly report, she said, setting it on his desk. He barely looked up. Thanks, she tilted her head. You okay? He nodded, too quickly. Just distracted. Ella walked around to the other side of the desk, resting her hand gently on his shoulder. Talk to me. He didn't move. Finally, he said, they're talking, the board, the press, investors. Ella stayed quiet. They're worried I'm getting distracted, he added. That I'm compromising the image of the company. She slowly pulled her hand back. I see. No, he said, standing up. That's not what I meant. I'm not blaming you. You don't have to, Ella replied softly. I've heard the whispers too. She turned to leave but paused. So what are you going to do about it? Alexander didn't answer, because he didn't know. That night, Ella sat on her balcony with a cup of tea staring into the dark city skyline. The stars were faint, the wind cool. But her heart was heavy. She had known, from the very beginning, that being close to Alexander meant stepping into a world full of rules, expectations, and scrutiny. But she hadn't realized how loud those expectations would get, how sharp those rules would become when emotions entered the picture. She wasn't ashamed of what they had, but if he was, then what were they really building? The next morning, she came into the office and found a coffee waiting on her desk. It was exactly how she liked it. 2 creams, no sugar, just a hint of cinnamon. She looked over at his office. The door was open. He was inside, pretending to read something, but she knew he was waiting for her reaction. She smiled, just a little, and took a sip, then got up and walked in. You trying to bribe me with caffeine? She asked. Alexander looked up. Is it working? She leaned against the doorframe. Not yet. He stood and walked over to her, his voice quieter than usual. I don't care what they say, Ella. She raised an eyebrow. I care what you say, he added. I didn't ask you to choose, she said. But I've already chosen, he replied. And it's not the image. It's not the board. It's not the company. He paused, then looked her straight in the eye. It's you. And for the first time in days, she let herself believe it again, but the pressure didn't go away. In fact, it only grew louder. The board called for a private meeting, no assistants, no PR staff, just the top executives and Alexander. The room was filled with cold expressions and clipped words. One of the senior partners, a man in his 60s with silver hair and sharper opinions, finally said what everyone else had been skirting around. You've built an empire, Alexander. Your name is synonymous with stability, discipline, and control. Don't let a personal entanglement unravel that. Alexander folded his hands on the table. With respect, this isn't your decision to make. You're the face of this company, another executive added. And this relationship, however personal, becomes part of the brand. He could feel the judgment, the pressure, the weight of their fears being dumped onto his shoulders. But this time, he didn't buckle. He stood. I've been called many things in this room over the years, he said. Smart, strategic, ruthless. He looked each of them in the eye. But the one thing I've never been called is happy. Silence. And now that I finally am, you want me to hide it, to treat it like a liability. He exhaled. I won't. Then he turned and walked out. Ella was in the hallway when he stepped out of the boardroom. She saw his face, and for a moment her breath caught. Because in his expression, she didn't see hesitation. She saw clarity. And he walked straight to her, right there in front of half the executive floor, and took her hand in his. Come with me, he said. She blinked. Where? Wherever I'm going next, he replied. And suddenly, all the noise didn't matter. That evening, they stood side by side at the elevator, the entire office still whispering behind their backs. But Alexander didn't care, because this time he wasn't just holding her hand, he was holding the truth. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of being seen. A week had passed since Alexander Pierce walked out of that boardroom with his hand in Ella's. And in that moment, it felt like everything had shifted, like he had finally chosen her over the image, the legacy, the fear. But real life has a way of testing declarations. And sometimes love isn't just about what you choose to hold on to. It's also about what you're willing to set free. It started with a phone call. Ella was sitting at her desk late in the afternoon when her phone buzzed. Unknown number, but the voice on the other end, very familiar. Ella Monroe? Yes. This is Julian Kessler from Vantage Strategies. We'd love to speak with you about an opportunity. Ella blinked. Vantage was one of the top firms in the country, creative, bold, fast-paced. She'd admired their work for years. We've been following your progress at Caldwell and Pierce. You've got an eye for organization, communication, and systems. And frankly, we're expanding. We think you'd be a perfect fit to lead our new operations division. Her heart skipped. That's unexpected. Julian chuckled. Sometimes the best things are. She didn't tell Alexander right away, not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't know what it meant yet. They had just found their rhythm, just started trusting what they were building. And this job, it was in another city, across the country. That evening, Alexander walked into his penthouse and found Ella sitting on the balcony, barefoot, wrapped in one of his oversized sweaters, a glass of wine in her hand, her hair dancing in the soft wind. He smiled at the sight. You waiting for me? She looked up and gave him that gentle, knowing smile that always seemed to undo him. Maybe. He sat beside her, silent for a moment, watching the lights flicker across the skyline. Then she said it. I got an offer today. He turned to her. A job offer? She nodded. Vantage Strategies, Director of Operations, in San Francisco. A long pause. How do you feel about it? He asked, voice even. I feel excited, terrified, guilty. Why guilty? Because part of me wants it, and part of me doesn't want to leave you. Alexander was quiet, not because he was angry, but because he had always known this day might come. Ella wasn't someone meant to live in someone else's shadow. She had always belonged to herself first. He reached for her hand. Ella, I didn't choose you just to keep you still. I chose you because of who you all are. She turned to him, eyes glossy. What if this breaks us? He shook his head. Then we build something stronger. Or we find a way, or we break. But whatever happens, it should never be because you held yourself back. The next morning, Ella emailed Vantage. I'm interested. Let's talk. Over the next 2 weeks, the weight of change hung in the air like a low hum. Alexander tried to stay present, to enjoy every moment he still had with her. But some part of him, old, cautious, afraid, began to retreat. He became quiet, more distant. Ella noticed. She always noticed. And one night after dinner at his apartment, she stood in front of him, arms crossed. Are you pulling away from me? Alexander didn't respond right away. Then finally, I don't know how to do this, Ella. Do what? Let you go. She softened, stepping toward him. I'm not asking you to let me go. I'm asking you to walk beside me, just in a different way. I've built my life around control, around knowing where everything and everyone belongs. I know. This, this is unpredictable. I know, she whispered, but so was loving me. The week before her departure, the company hosted a farewell gathering for Ella. Nothing grand, just a quiet send-off in the conference lounge. People brought cupcakes. James gave a hilariously awkward speech that made everyone laugh. And Miriam, the stoic executive secretary, even hugged her. Ella smiled, laughed, thanked them all, but she kept glancing toward the door. Alexander never came. That night, as she packed the last of her things, she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Alexander standing there. No suit, no pretense, just a man holding a small box. He handed it to her without a word. Inside was a silver compass. Engraved beneath it the words, "Wherever you go, I'll find you." Ella looked up, tears welling in her eyes. "I was afraid I'd lose you," he admitted. "You never had to be afraid," she whispered. "But I needed to know you believed in me enough to let me grow." He stepped forward, pulled her close, and kissed her. Not like a goodbye, but like a promise. The next morning, she boarded a plane. He didn't stop her. He didn't ask her to stay. Because for the first time in his life, Alexander Pierce realized love wasn't about control. It was about freedom. And if she was brave enough to chase what set her soul on fire, then he would be brave enough to wait. It had been 42 days since Ella left. Not that Alexander was counting, except he was. Every morning he woke up alone. The side of the bed she used to curl into stayed untouched. Her coffee mug sat by the sink, as if she'd return any second to rinse it out. The books she'd started reading, but never finished, still lined his shelf. Bookmarks halfway through, pages gently folded, like she'd only paused, not left. But she was gone. Not emotionally, not completely. They texted, called, shared photos of little things, sunsets, coffee art, inside jokes. But the distance between them wasn't just miles. It was life. Her new job, her new team, her new rhythm. And Alexander, he was still at Caldwell and Pierce. Still CEO. Still cold marble floors and pressed suits and meetings scheduled to the second. But something was missing now. Color. At first, he tried to bury it. The ache. He stayed late at the office, took on more deals, attended more dinners, let the board think he was back to normal. But late at night, in the stillness of his penthouse, he wasn't fine. He missed the way Ella would hum softly when she typed, missed her rolling her eyes when he got too serious, missed her hands, always moving, always expressive, whether she was explaining a project or making him laugh with some ridiculous metaphor. The silence left in her absence was sharp, constant, like a song he'd heard only once but couldn't forget. One Friday afternoon, James Carter walked into Alexander's office, unannounced. A rare act of rebellion. "You look like a man who's slowly being eaten alive by his own thoughts," James said, flopping onto the guest chair. Alexander didn't look up. "I'm busy." "Busy avoiding feelings?" Alexander exhaled. "What do you want?" James shrugged. "I want to know when you're going to stop pretending you're okay with this long-distance, text message version of love." Alexander's jaw tightened. James leaned forward. "She didn't leave you, you know. She left the job, the city, but not you." Silence. "She's not asking for you to chase her, Alex," James added. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't." That night, Alexander stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the same skyline he had conquered. And suddenly it felt like nothing. He didn't want power. He didn't want to prove anything anymore. He just wanted to hear her laugh in the next room, to walk by her desk and see her smile up at him like she used to. And that's when he knew. He had to go. 3 days later, Alexander arrived in San Francisco. No warning, no grand gesture, just him and a quiet hope. He stood outside the glass building of Vantage Strategies, watching through the tinted windows as people buzzed through their afternoon meetings. Then for a moment he saw her. Ella, wearing a slate gray blazer, her hair pulled back, her brow furrowed in concentration as she explained something to a team huddled around her desk. She looked at home. She looked strong. And Alexander felt pride swell in his chest. Not because she was his, but because she was fully herself. He didn't go inside, not yet. Instead, he walked to a nearby cafe and sent her a text. I'm here. No pressure, just wanted to see you smile again. 10 minutes later, he heard the bell above the cafe door. She stepped in, a little breathless, a little stunned. You really came, she said. He stood. I had to. There were 100 things she could have said, questions, doubts, concerns, but instead she stepped forward and hugged him, not tentative, not shy. A full arms around his back, I've missed you more than I can say kind of hug. He held her like a man returning from war. They sat by the window, coffees untouched. Alexander spoke first. I thought I could handle it, the distance, the routine, but everything just stopped making sense. Ella studied him, her eyes softer than he remembered. I missed you too. He looked down, hands clasped. I don't want to be just a voice on the phone or a name in your inbox. She nodded slowly. So what are you saying? He met her gaze. I want to find a way to build something real. Together. Even if it looks different from what we imagined. Ella smiled. I think we already started building it. The night you let me go and didn't try to cage me. He reached across the table, took her hand gently. What if I stayed for a while, he asked. Here? Not to hover, not to disrupt, just to be near, to see where this version of us fits. She turned her palm to hold his properly. I think I'd like that. That evening they walked through the marina. The sun dipped low, painting gold across the water. Wind in their hair, silence between them, not empty but peaceful. As they paused to look at the skyline, Ella whispered, You look lighter. Alexander chuckled. I feel terrified. She laughed, then reached up and brushed a strand of hair off his face. You're doing great. That night, in a quiet rented apartment a few blocks from hers, Alexander lay awake, but not in restlessness, in wonder. Because sometimes love doesn't demand that you chase it or control it. Sometimes love waits patiently. And sometimes, if you're brave enough to follow the ache in your chest, you might just find the thing you never believed you deserved. A month passed, then another. Alexander Pierce had now been living in San Francisco for 52 days. And for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't counting. Not because time no longer mattered, but because his days finally had meaning. No board meetings at dawn, no scripted conversations, no 1,000-yard stares from high-rise windows. Instead, there were simple things. A shared coffee in the morning, a walk through the Sunday farmer's market. The way Ella would lean into him during quiet moments, like she knew his silence better than anyone ever had. He still worked, of course. He had built too much to simply walk away. But now he did it on his own terms, remotely, with space for something he'd never allowed before. Life. One evening as the fog rolled in over the bay, Alexander and Ella sat on her rooftop, blankets wrapped around their shoulders, a bottle of red wine between them. Neither spoke for a while. The city glowed softly beneath them, lights flickering like little promises in the dark. Then Ella said, Do you ever miss it? Alexander turned to her. Miss what? The world you left behind. He thought for a long moment before answering. I miss who I pretended to be, he said quietly. The man with all the answers, the man who never felt anything too deeply. She looked at him. You don't miss the power? He smiled faintly. I used to think control was the same as peace, but it wasn't. It was just silence. He took her hand. You gave me something louder and warmer. She leaned her head on his shoulder. You gave me the courage to believe I could be more than an assistant. They sat like that for a long time, two people who had spent most of their lives avoiding connection, now finally resting in it. But even peace, like anything beautiful, eventually asks for a decision. One afternoon, Ella came home to find Alexander standing by the window, holding an envelope. He turned when she entered. They want me back. She nodded slowly. I figured they might. Full time, he added. In person, in New York. Ella's heart didn't skip. It didn't twist. It simply waited. And what do you want, she asked. Alexander looked at the letter in his hand, then at her. I want to build something permanent, something that doesn't disappear when the contract ends or the headlines fade. He stepped closer. I want to come home every day to the person who knows me, not the version I present to the world. The real me." Her voice was soft. "You already do." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm going to turn it down." Her eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "I'm not just sure," he whispered. "I'm certain." That night, Alexander cooked dinner. Badly. The pasta was overcooked, the sauce too salty, the garlic bread nearly burned. Ella laughed the entire way through. And in that tiny kitchen, with mismatched plates and wine glasses that didn't belong together, he realized something. This was home. Not the penthouse, not the title, but the sound of her laughter. The warmth of her touch. The quiet space where he could be and still be loved. 3 weeks later, he proposed. Not at a grand gala, not on a rooftop, not with cameras or chandeliers, but on a Wednesday morning in the middle of Ella's tiny apartment, with her hair still messy from sleep and his tie half knotted. He handed her a simple ring and said, "There's no version of life that feels full without you in it." She stared at him, then laughed, then cried, then whispered, "Yes." Their wedding was small, intimate, held in the garden behind a local cafe they both loved. James flew in. Miriam sent a letter with a handwritten, "I always knew you'd make him human," at the bottom. Even the old security guard from Caldwell and Pierce mailed them a bottle of wine and a note. "Never thought I'd see the day." Ella wore a white dress with bare shoulders and joy in her eyes. Alexander wore a navy suit and a look of peace no one had seen on his face in decades. As they stood beneath the string lights and exchanged vows, the world didn't stop. But for them, it finally made sense. That night, they danced slowly under the stars. No music, no crowd, just the wind, the candles, the hush between heartbeats. And when Alexander leaned in to kiss her, he didn't feel panic. He didn't feel fear. He felt home. They didn't promise to be perfect. They didn't vow never to hurt each other or lose their way. But they did promise this: to be real, to be present, to never run when things got hard, to choose each other again and again, even on the quiet, messy days. Because love, true love, isn't built on grand gestures. It's built on mornings like this. Burnt toast, warm hands, soft laughter, and the courage to say, "You matter more than anything I thought I needed." This was their story. A man who built walls so high even he couldn't see past them. A woman who walked in without fear, holding nothing but truth and light. And two hearts who learned, against all odds, that love isn't about never being broken. It's about finding someone who sees the cracks and loves you more because of them. Dear listener, if you've made it this far, you've just walked through an emotional journey, one that wasn't just about romance, but about healing, growth, and courage. Alexander Pierce taught us that no matter how much success you have, you can still be haunted by fear. And Ella Monroe showed us that love doesn't mean saving someone. It means walking beside them while they learn to save themselves. So what can we take from this story? Let people in even when it feels uncomfortable. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the doorway to real connection. Love isn't about control. It's about presence. It's about showing up again and again, even when it's not convenient, even when it's hard. And most of all, don't wait too long to say how you feel. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't falling in love. It's never giving it the chance to begin. If this story touched your heart in any way, if you saw a piece of yourself in Alexander's fear or Ella's strength, please take a moment to like this video. It helps more than you know. Leave a comment below. What part of their story spoke to you the most? Have you ever had to let someone go to help them grow, or be brave enough to come back? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next emotional, real-life inspired journey we share. Because stories like these remind us we're not alone. Until next time, take care of your heart and take a chance on love. And take a